In all of this and thinking about usability, we obviously have to convince others why this is important. And so if you're just designing your own thing, it's easy to convince yourself, or maybe it's not, and I should convince you why usability matters. But a lot of times this comes up in context of larger companies where you have to convince someone that, why should we even be thinking about usability? Why should we be doing usability evaluations? And it really comes down to there being a lot of competition out there. If you're designing a website or an app and you have competitors, then users are going to use the one that's easier to deal with and work with. And so creating a product that has a smoother experience and a smoother interaction is going to be more pleasurable, more interesting, and people will come back to that. People encounter usability problems because of just human nature, and so going into a design and building a product thinking that no one's going to have a usability problem is really, really unlikely, and it's probably the wrong philosophy and approach to take. Because as humans, we just have limitations. We can do certain things really, really well, and other things we're just limited in. We're limited in our attention span, short-term memory, certain cognitive processes are just hard. And then add on environmental factors. So if you're in a busy work environment, or you're on the bus, or you're waiting in line, you might have just had a really bad day and you're really stressed. All of that has an impact on how your mind is working and functioning. And so all of those will impact someone's ability to use a product. And so I think a much better approach to thinking about design is that people will have problems. And so thinking about how can we ensure that we're at least trying our best to prevent those errors from happening. One of the arguments that I've heard is that, well, my users are really smart. They have PhDs, or they're doctors, or I deal with scientists or IT professionals. They all know, they're really, really smart, so they're going to understand the content on the site, or they're going to be able to find this information because they're used to digging through lots of information. But think about these people's day-to-day lives and their work, and if they're really busy, they are probably thinking about all the stuff that has to happen after that little bit of information that they need from your website, or that one task they want to complete. And so it's a really natural thing for people to encounter usability problems. We as humans just make mistakes, and it's okay that we make mistakes. So as designers, what can we do to prevent those mistakes, but also help people recover from those? So that's also a huge component of thinking about usability, is not just preventing the errors from happening, but thinking about helping people through possible mistakes that they might make in using a product. One of the concepts that has helped me a lot in thinking about design and psychology and understanding why we can't just design products that are easy to use for people is thinking about mental models. As humans have mental models about everything. Sort of any situation that you can think of, you have a mental model of what that might be. So it's another way to think about it is your expectation of what is going to happen, what something might look like. Like if someone says, oh, I bought you a new cell phone, then you have certain expectations about what that phone is. Is it a smartphone? What features, maybe if you have an iPhone, then you expect to be getting an iPhone. What your mental model is hugely dependent on your past experiences. And so we have mental models not just about things, but also about events and activities and processes. So if you think about going out to buy a cup of coffee in the morning from a cafe, you have certain expectations, what's going to happen, what that's going to look like, how it's going to be set up. And that's all dependent on where you're from and where you live and what you've experienced in the past. And so if we think about that and apply that to the design of digital interfaces, people have expectations of how a website's going to work, and they have expectations of how an app is going to work based on how they've used them in the past and how they've been designed in the past. And so as designers, what we want to do is map our model of what we're designing to meet users' expectations. So that's really sort of core of designing products to avoid usability issues, is making sure that we're mapping our model and sort of the intention of the design to what people are going to experience. The hardest thing in that is that our users are coming from all different backgrounds and places. And so I'm not saying this is an easy thing to do, but it might help in understanding why you can't, as a designer or engineer or product manager, just say we're going to choose this type of design and this flow, and because it works for me and I understand it, it's going to work for all my users, because they might just have a different expectation based on what they've done in the past. Because this idea of a mental model can be, it's very conceptual. I like looking at graphics online and trying to find images that explain what a mental model is and why we have differing mental models. And so one of my all-time favorites is this one that it shows a conversation between two people and they're talking about ice and something that's made out of ice. But one's thinking iceberg when they hear ice and the other one's thinking ice cubes. And so without enough context around what you mean by ice, people can interpret that to mean two totally different things. My husband and I actually joke about this because when we think of what a house is, we have very different mental models based on where we grew up. Because I grew up in the Netherlands where there's lots of tall houses that are all attached to each other. He grew up in Arizona, which lots of one-story houses, single homes too, not attached to the homes next to them. And so we have very different expectations of what a house is. The big takeaway in all of this is that designing products that are easy for people to use requires a lot of empathy with people and understanding a little bit of basic psychology and caring about the people who will use your product. And so you have to spend a little bit of time with your customers, with your users, thinking about who they are, what they need, and especially on thinking about mental models, what past experiences they've had so that you know how they're coming into this, what they're thinking about, how they might attempt to use your product. And it's that human element, that human component that will make you a much better designer and a designer with empathy, which will create products that are easier to use.